I'm on. Yes. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for coming to Friday Morning Coffee. I appreciate the fact that you are not in your jammies, in your apartment, drinking coffee and listening to delightful presentations. But I appreciate your being here. And we're so excited to have our guest this morning, and Tim Bryant, that heads our Bully program, gets all these wonderful people for us on Brunau's time at Friday Morning Coffee. So I'm going to pass this to Tim to do our introductions.
Well, we're pleased to be back here this fall, and the Bully program has gotten off to a great start. This was our opening week to the new program year in our fall session, and we're excited to be here with the Friday Morning Coffees again. I'm pleased today to introduce Bob Maddox. I think you will thoroughly enjoy Bob. He is actually teaching a course for Bully, and actually two sections of it, and one of those sections is meeting here at LVE. We actually have three courses that are being taught here at LVE. Karen Sermons and Bill Coates are teaching the other two, and we have quite a few folks enrolled in those classes, and we're very grateful to be able to be out here and be present. Bob was a speechwriter and religious liaison in the Carter White House. He and his wife, Linda, were able to maintain a most cordial friendship with the Carters all the way through their term in office. They visited Plains with a great deal of regularity, and Bob even preached several times at the Carters' local Baptist church in Plains there during the White House days. Linda, Bob's wife, and a friend of hers wrote a book on Rosalind Carter, and Bob was able to attend both Rosalind and Jimmy's funerals here. They cherish those memories and those friendships that they had with the Carters. Bob is a native of Atlanta. He's a graduate of Clarkston High School in Clarkston, Georgia. And most importantly, he's a graduate of Baylor University. So I've got a kinship there. And also Southwestern Baptist Seminary and Emory University. We'll forgive him for Emory. My career, our Bob's career has been in the ministry and Baptist churches, and most recently in the United Church of Christ. He has written several books and continues to write. He and his wife Linda have been married for 66 years. They have 3 children, and they live here locally at the Phoenix on Lake Lanier. And it is my pleasure to introduce Bob Maddox to you today.
Thank you very much. It's a real delight for me to be here. Beautiful place. We like Phoenix very well. A few years ago, my wife developed Alzheimer's, the process. So we were living in Maryland at that particular time. We had spent many years in Maryland for several reasons. We moved into an assisted living there in Maryland, lovely place, and then decided we would come here. Andy and Tina Maddox have lived here forever and ever and ever. They have 3 sons, all of whom were born and raised here. We have 5 splendid grandchildren. You brag about yours. You don't know anything about grandchildren until you let me talk about mine. We can't get any of them married, so we don't have any great-grandchildren. My joke is that we know of. That's the way that works. So anyway, my Jimmy Carter story begins in 1964. I was fresh out of seminary and had the grand opportunity to become pastor of the First Baptist Church of Vienna, Georgia, down in Dooley County. Literally, as we were moving in, we moved in at Thanksgiving, I had still, my books were all piled up in boxes and all. And Jody Powell called. Jody was one of the darlings of the town. His family went back many generations in Dooley County. Jody had gone to you may know his story, he'd gone to the Air Force Academy, had done very well. He was a senior. And then he said, for some very stupid reason, he was taking a test and excused himself to go to the bathroom. And while he was in the bathroom, he looked at the answers and had no reason to do that. He knew what he was doing. Went back, told the teacher, and he was home in Vienna within a couple of days. He called me. I was brand new, like I said, brand new. And so we sat literally on the boxes of books for about 2 or 3 hours that night while Jody talked about himself. So that began the friendship. Jody had not finished the academy, so I think he went to either Emory or somewhere to finish. And then he started a master's degree, if I've got the story straight, started a master's degree, and he wanted to write about a Georgia politician. And that's when he connected up with gubernatorial candidate Jimmy Carter. And Jody became Jimmy's driver. And then Jody and Hamilton Jordan were the real engineers behind the scenes to get Carter elected governor. And then they played a key role very substantial role in Carter's election. So all of that kind of stuff. But then, about 1967, my father and Jimmy knew each other. They were both, in those days, earlier days, active in the Baptist Brotherhood. And they did some stuff. I'm not quite sure what they did, but they did some stuff together. And so as I was about to go on vacation, my father said, "Who is going to preach for you?" And I said, "Frankly, I haven't got anybody yet." And he said, "You should call Jimmy over in Plains. Vienna is about 30, 40 minutes from Plains." So I did. I picked up the phone, Jimmy, and Jimmy came and preached while I was gone on vacation. He did it 2 summers. He was running for governor in both cases, and the word was out that he would come preach, but he would not take an honorarium. So we could get a free preacher, and that was a big deal. And of course, Carter was running for governor, and he came and preached in Vienna those 2 years. Later, when we were at the White House, we had a meeting in the Oval Office, and Carter said, "You know, I used to preach for Bob, but every time I came, he left." So that started it, the whole thing with the Carters. Then he was governor. He came briefly to the church. I was on a church staff. He came briefly. He came one Wednesday night supper for that. And then the really story begins when we moved to Calhoun. I finished my coursework at Emory and had the opportunity to become pastor of the First Baptist Church of Calhoun. So we moved there in 1971. By then we had 2 sons, Ben and Andy, and then literally as we were moving, Elizabeth, our daughter, was born. And in Calhoun, without me realizing it, was really a hotbed, if you please, of Carterism. Bert Lance had headed the Calhoun Bank, and Carter named him head of the highway department. So Bert Lance lived there, and as we were moving into Calhoun, the president's older son, Jack, moved there, and he married, in the course of all this, he married a lady from Calhoun, Judy Langford, and they became real active in our church, at First Baptist Church. So all of this stuff was happening there. I never had any contact with Governor Carter. It just didn't work out. If he came to Calhoun for anything, I never did know it. But then one day Jack came by the office and said, "My father is going to run for president." And of course the joke was, "President of what?" And So immediately we were all plugged in and plugged into that. And then I, as a minister, I was really excited about it. I couldn't talk about it very much. But Linda, my wife, campaigned with Judy. They flew 2 or 3 places on the private planes, and Linda campaigned a little bit with Judy Carter by then. When he was elected, we were good friends, really cordial friends. And by then, of course, we were watching breathlessly every news cycle when he began to really win. Jimmy and Hamilton and Jody realized that they could win the Iowa primary, that would set the trajectory for him to be elected president. So he and his family spent many untold hours in Iowa, up and down the street, sleeping on couches. Carter was so frugal, many stories about his frugality, stinginess, and so they wouldn't spend money on hotels. They stayed with people. They would just kind of camp out on couches and guest bedrooms for people all over. Some of you guys were on the Peanut Brigade, scattered all over the country with all of that. So the night of the election, Linda and I were invited with Jack and Judy to be with them in their suite in the hotel while the election returns came in. And what was it, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, when Mississippi voted, gave their votes to Carter, he was president. And so it was an unbelievably heady moment for all of us to be there when Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer from Plains, was elected president of the United States. Great moment, wonderful moment. It still reverberates with me in that. I think I drank 3 bottles of Pepto-Bismol that night, waiting for the election returns to come in. We did all of that, and then the inauguration. We went to the inauguration, and our funds were limited. We were comfortable, but we couldn't just turn loose and go stay in a fancy hotel for the inauguration. So we had 2 pianos. Linda always taught piano, and Mother had a piano, and we had that, and we had our own piano. Lovely black upright piano. I sold the piano so we'd have money to go to the inauguration, and we went, had a great time, had good in all of that, had the seats there. A lot of the people from Calhoun and all got to go into the White House as the parade wound down, but I had to get back to Vine. I had a wedding, and I had to get back for that, so we did not get to go into the White House that night. But from the very beginning, I realized that every president, since at least Eisenhower, had somebody representing the White House with the American religious community. So I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I've often said if Carter had brought me in sooner, he probably would have been reelected, that kind of thing. But so I kept saying I would like to do that. I even wrote him, and I got a letter back from him saying that he believed in the separation of church and state and didn't think that was a good idea. But I've discovered later that Rosalind realized that the American religious climate was changing rapidly. Cable TV had come in, and every preacher that could had a cable ministry, all of that kind of stuff. And Carter didn't fit the bill. Carter clearly was a Christian. He was clearly a Baptist layman who was deeply entrenched there. But Carter was too much a man of the world at the same time as a Christian. And when he said something like he was opposed to abortion, but by then abortion was the law of the land, that the White House would comply with that. And that set off all kinds of negative bells because by then abortion, we could talk about that a long time, had become a very highly politicized issue in American life, particularly among the more conservative Christian folk. And then the word slipped out that Carter had a gay person on the White House staff. And that was just kind of the tipping point in that era. And so the religious community began to turn against Carter. He didn't fit the bill. Didn't matter that as soon as they moved to Washington, they joined the First Baptist Church in D.C. up on 16th Street, and he taught Sunday school regularly, even there. Not all the time, but regularly. So, but, you know, it was all changing. Tumult was changing there. And then, because by then Jody was press secretary, and we kept up with Jody and Nan and a bunch of stuff. And every now and then, Jody knew I wanted to go to work at the White House. Every now and then, Jody would call and say, the president or Miss Carter are speaking somewhere, give us some ideas about a speech, which was this very exciting to me. And I did. I was more than happy to do that. And then one of the big things that Carter did, probably his most lasting legacy, was to work out the treaty between Egypt and Israel, the great moment with Sadat and Begin at Camp David when he worked out that treaty thing. He was there and back, and it looked like it was going to work, and then it fell apart. And then Carter and the crew flew to the Middle East, and he did a shuttle back and forth between Begin and Sadat, and landed at Andrews Air Force Base one Sunday night, a rainy Sunday night, probably January, and he said, you know, the TV, we have a treaty, and we will have a signing ceremony in the right time. So, bing, I said, he's going to need a speech for that signing ceremony. He didn't ask me to do it. Nobody knew I was doing it. We didn't have email. We didn't have fax, any of that stuff. But a friend of mine, a very cordial friend of mine, had coined the phrase, used the phrase, peace like war is waged. Peace like war is waged. So that struck. And so I wrote a speech built around that idea of waging peace. I didn't even tell Linda that I was doing this. You know, they all would have thought I was nutso to try to do something like that. When I got it written, I let Linda look at it, and Edna Langford, who we'll talk about her in a minute, they looked at it and thought it was a good idea. What do I do with that? I didn't know anybody in the White House. I mean, I knew Jody, but I had met Mrs. Carter's press secretary, Mary Hoyt Finch, and I just put it in the mail, put the speech in the mail, and sent it to Mary Hoyt at the White House, and really sort of forgot it. You know, sure, that's going. About 3 hours before the signing ceremony, Jody called Linda. Really, I was out of town. And in fact, that day I had written a speech for Mrs. Carter. All of this was while I was still pastor in Calhoun. Jody called and said to Linda, you and Bob had better get to a TV. The president is using your speech. And he did. You know, it was just talk about heady, puff, all this kind of stuff. And he did. And later, Jack told me, Jack Carter said, as he and the president walked back into the White House, the president turned to Jack and said, well, how did you like my Georgia speech? So within a very short time, the White House was calling me. They had a turnover, and they invited me to come up to Washington and interview to be a speechwriter. You know, of course, unbelievably, just out of my mind there. But I was hired. I was hired as a speechwriter for the President of the United States. It was just astounding. uh, we came back, and I was supposed to keep it quiet, no talk at all about it, until the White House broke the news. And I want to watch my time here. And so, but the time came when I had to resign First Baptist Church. And so on a Sunday morning, in May, April, about April, I told the congregation that I was leaving, that I was resigning. I had great experience there, and what had happened. And without me knowing it, without me remembering, our Sunday morning worship service was on the radio, local little bitty radio station. And the manager of the radio station heard it, and he broke the news to the world that I was going to the White House. And so it was great. We loved it, opportunity to do it. I went on up in May. Linda was a school teacher, and we had 3 kids, so we didn't really move until in June. But we moved to Washington for me to begin to work at the White House. It was like you have. We had been up and down Pennsylvania Avenue and had seen the White House, had never been in the White House. So I stayed with friends out in Virginia and caught the subway into town. And that first morning there, caught the subway, got off the subway, and I looked around and I couldn't find the White House. And I turned to just a stranger and I said, "Where is the White House?" And he said, almost said, "You dummy, that's it right there. You know, it's right there through Lafayette Park." So anyway, went in, swore in, started out in the Xerox room, began writing speeches for the president, million stories, a presidential. The astounding thing for me in that speech I wrote that he used for the treaty, it went pretty quickly. Normally, somebody invites the president to come do something or another, and that's vetted up and down through the line there. Is this a good idea? Is this appropriate? What could he gain from doing this? You know, all of that kind of stuff. And then a speech is assigned. The head speechwriter, who was Rick Hertzberg, would get the word that the president is doing so-and-so, and then he would assign one of us, about 6 of us, to do the original draft. So we would, day and night, after a while time means nothing. We would write the speech, and then it had to be vetted, you know, all through the State Department, everywhere, because anything the president might say had to be carefully vetted and balanced and all like that. As far as I know, the speech he used for me at the treaty moved with lightning speed, but others anyway. So that's what I began to do. I also picked up pretty quickly the animosity among the conservative American religious community against Carter, which is very unfair, and the White House. By then, the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, moral majority, all of that was happening. And Rosalind is the one who conveyed to me that I needed to begin to really relate to the religious community. And so I opened my doors. They finally took me out of the Xerox room. I had my own little office. And I began to meet with all of these preachers, that was the era of the TV preachers. Oral Roberts, Jerry Falwell, on and on and on and on and on. And they'd all felt closed out of the White House. And suddenly I was willing and eager to meet with them. They were interesting people, many of them kind of kooky. And all of them getting rich off the TV. You know, if you love Jesus, send me money and you'll be blessed. And so money began to pour in to all of these preachers. And we got particularly to know Oral Roberts and his wife, and we got to know Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Sad story of Jim and Famity. Carter had been to Russia and had agreed to a strategic arms limitation treaty with Brezhnev, who was the head of Russia at that particular time. But then he had to get it ratified by the Senate. He had a Democratic Senate and House, but a lot of conflict there. I was in New York for a meeting with religious leaders, and Rosalind called me, and she said that Billy Graham had made some comments about the need for peace. He didn't comment particularly about the treaty, but Rosalind said, you ought to go meet Billy Graham and see what he might do to help in this process. So I said, yes, ma'am. And probably that same day or the next day, I flew to Asheville and was met there by his chief of staff and went to Billy Graham's home up on the mountain there. A most cordial time. Met him and Ruth, spent a couple of hours with Billy Graham at his beautiful home up there. The thing that I've always said about Graham is, number one, he never took himself that seriously. He was by then a worldwide figure, but he did not take himself that seriously. And he never did take on the trappings of these other TV preachers. They had a nice house, but they'd been in it a long time. And they stayed there. He died there. So I had a very cordial time with Billy Graham. But he told me, he said, I'm totally supportive of what the president is doing with that treaty, but obviously I cannot speak out for or against the treaty. But anyway, so that was my moment with Billy Graham, very cordial, very memorable time. Now, a bunch of stories, quickly. We Baptists do not baptize babies. You know, we don't do that. But we dedicate parent and child and baby. So, while we were in Calhoun there, Jack and Judy's son, Jason, was born. Jason Carter was born. Jason is a great man now. He's head of the Carter Center. I mean, he's the chairman of the board and all. He was a babe in arms. So we set a date for the parent-child dedication, Jack and Judy and Jason. And then the word came that the president was coming to Calhoun for that event. Big deal, you know. You can just imagine. Here came Secret Service. Here came technology people, and on and on and on. So Carter flew into Atlanta to Warner Robins, or whatever the big Air Force base. Right, Dobbins. And then helicopters, from Atlanta up to Calhoun. I was at the tarmac when the helicopter landed and met him there. Had a wonderful weekend, had a great weekend. I had learned a long time ago as the minister not to try to come in with the choir. The choir was always disorganized. There was always some kind of, I'm sure if you were in the choir, it didn't happen to you, but there's always some kind of little conflict in the choir. And I quickly said, I don't have to do this. Somebody else can pray with the choir. So I would just go out, when I got ready, just go out and sit down. So that particular Sunday, I did the same, went out and sat down. We had a beautiful new building. And it was me and Carter in the sanctuary practically by ourselves. I didn't talk with him. He didn't talk with me. I remember very well what I talked about. But it was a great weekend, great weekend. Then he left, went back. But it was a memorable weekend, pictures and all that kind of stuff with by then the president. I had not yet gone to the White House. I was still pastor in Calhoun. It kind of all picked up after that, because in the spring of that year, it's when, in the spring of the next year, is when I went to the White House. He came another time, but Rosalind was coming. This is one of my favorite stories. Rosalind was coming to be with Jack and Judy over Labor Day of what? 78, 79, whatever it was in there. And she was coming to church that Sunday. We knew Jack and Judy well enough to know that Judy was not a good cook. She just didn't like to cook. And we only had a couple of restaurants in town at that early stage. And I knew that if they went to the restaurant, they wouldn't get to eat. Everybody would be. So before we left for church that morning, I told Linda, I said, why don't you just put a roast in the oven? We did that all the time, you know. You did that all the time. Sure, we'd do that. And sure enough, when church was over, I saw Jack and Judy and Rosalind off over there in the corner, kind of buzzing around. And I walked over there and I said, why don't you guys come to our house for lunch? And they said, yeah, we'll do that. So then I went up and whispered to Linda, you might better get home. We may have company coming. And she said, you didn't do that. I said, I did. I really did. I did that. And by the time we got home, Secret Service and the limousines and everything was in the yard. And Rosalind and Judy and Jack were in the house. And Rosalind had kicked off her shoes and was walking around in our kitchen barefooted, doing something. I don't know what it was. But that was Labor Day. That was the Labor Day weekend. And that was the weekend before the Camp David thing began the next day. So Rosalind and I sat at the dining room table talking about the Camp David thing. She filled me in on all of that. We sat there until she actually had to leave. She was flying out of Chattanooga to get to Camp David for the beginning of the treaty conversations. And in the midst of in that lunch, she said, now Thanksgiving, now this is Labor Day, she said, Thanksgiving, we're having the National Bible event, and we're inviting religious leaders to come for that. Why don't you help us put a list together? Of course, that was sick 'em to a bulldog for me. Of course, I'd love to do that. And I did. I gave a lot of my friends and family and a lot of religious leaders from around the country that I'd come to know. I mean, that I knew of. They didn't know me. I knew them. So we did. We went. We flew up. A friend in town there was attending, and he had a private plane. And so we flew on his plane to Washington. Had a big event, a gorgeous event. Haley Mills' father, John Mills, the actor, had memorized the book of Acts. And he was going around the country and around the world reciting as a presentation the entire book of Acts, and that was the event. Then we had dinner in the White House. And then the Carters left for Camp David. They stayed for a little bit. Carter never ate with us, you know. If he was making a speech at a banquet, he would come in later. I don't know what that was. So they went to Camp David, and it was arranged for Linda and me to spend the night in the White House in the Lincoln bedroom. So we spent the night in the Lincoln bedroom. The bedroom was actually Abraham Lincoln's office. In his time, that was his office on the second floor. And in the corner of the room over there was a early draft copy of the Gettysburg Address. You know, he fiddled with that, he wrote on it, and he was in the corner. And Linda said, Bob did not sleep a wink that night. He knew Lincoln's ghost was going to come in and all of that. So we spent the night in that White House, and it was a great event. And then all of the Camp David stuff began to unfold. So we moved up there in the spring of 1979. We were there, almost 2 years, not quite 2 years with them. 1 million stories happened out of all of that. A couple of them that stand out that I love to talk about. As Easter came up, Easter of 80, the president's secretary called and said, the president would like for you to come to Camp David and lead an Easter sunrise service at Camp David if you can arrange it. And I thought, I bet I can arrange that, you know. I bet I can figure that one out. So we did, and it turned out all of us went. Andy Abney was home from college, and so we were sort of the Von Trapp family that morning. I preached, Linda played the piano, Elizabeth, my daughter, read the scripture, and Andy and Ben sang. And so great moment there. Sunrise coming up from, if you've been to Camp David, you know, you can stand out on the patio of the President's Lodge and almost see Gettysburg, you know. It's kind of over the hill over there. So it's not very far. It's up in the Catoctin Mountains up in Maryland there. So we did all of that. It was a great experience. But we did the Easter sunrise, and then we had breakfast. And then we had a lot of kids. Elizabeth, my daughter, was only about 7 or 8 at that particular time. So the mothers or somebody decided we would have an Easter egg hunt. So we did. It was me and another father, and then the president were designated to hide the Easter eggs. So we were out in the yard there at the Presidential Lodge hiding Easter eggs. And I looked across the lawn, their beautiful lawn, and there was Jimmy Carter leaning over, hiding Easter eggs in the bushes. And I turned to myself and I said, "Self, a Baptist preacher from Georgia hiding Easter eggs with the President of the United States at Camp David. It doesn't get any better than this, you know." So those are great moments there. He lost, terrible. Reagan, smooth talking, and Carter was not the world's greatest orator. Reagan was one of the great orators. It was a horrible time. The Camp David was, they had done that, but inflation was out the roof. The hostage by then had been taken. It was just a terrible time for him. And the religious community had turned against him. And Mr. Reagan, who had not been to church in 50 years, suddenly became the savior. They really said the savior of the country. All the Christian magazines carried his picture on the front of it. So the tide obviously was turning against Jimmy Carter. So by then, Linda had written a book. We wrote a couple of books. Linda and a friend, as Tim mentioned, wrote Rosalind, Friend and First Lady. She wrote that book. She'd become very good friends with Mrs. Carter, with Rosalind. And Linda was on a book tour for that book out in somewhere. And then I was campaigning then. You have to be careful how you campaign if you're on the White House staff. And Linda said, "The polls may say he's winning. I don't think so." You know, it would look really bad. So sure enough, election was on Tuesday. Jody called us on Sunday, pouring down rain, gray, dismal November day. And he said, "Bob, it's over. We're not going to pull this out." So we were just heart-stricken. We'd pretty well decided that we couldn't stay much longer. We were running out of money. In fact, we had already run out of money. When I went, they said the salary is such and such, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. And then I got there and realized I didn't have a parsonage. I didn't have any tax breaks. And the first paycheck I got, I said, "No, there's a mistake here." There's just a bad mistake here. Because all of the benefits of the pastor were gone. So anyway, we survived. We struggled along. We were going to the hotel for his concession speech. Typically, the president waits until the California returns are in. Carter knew he was beat. Our friends called us and said, "We're leaving right now for the hotel." Linda and I really had to scramble to get to the hotel. We made it in time for him to do the concession speech. we many stories after the election. The weeks between the election and the inauguration, the word was out that Nancy Reagan had bought a $10,000 mink coat that she was going to wear for the inauguration. Okay, beautiful mink coat. Nancy was a classy lady. In the midst of all of that, again, secretary called and said the Carters would like for you and Linda to come to supper, come to dinner with them. We thought it'd be a big crowd there. It was just the two of us. Really nice moment. And we had fried chicken. And the White House staff, really wonderful people, served us chicken. And then they left the room, and Carter said, I've been here 4 years, and they still don't know how to fry chicken. And they don't know how to make grits, So Linda got off the elevator, and we met you go upstairs, on the elevator. And Rosalind met us at the elevator. And Linda said, by then we were Rosalind. It was always Mr. President, but she was Rosalind. And Linda said, Rosalind, I hope it's 100 degrees on inauguration day. And the president overheard that, and he said, "No, we'll have none of that. Don't worry, we're not going to do any of that." Got off the elevator, and Rosalind said, "Where is the will of God in this?" And I said, "Rosalind, Miss Carter, I have no idea what the will of God is." I said, "My hope is, and my hunch is, that you and the president will be able to do, as former White House people, what you had wanted to do and started here." And she said, "But I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to lose. I don't want to go home." But they did. They went home to Plains, and another whole world began to open up for them out of all of that. I always get uncomfortable a little bit when people say his presidency was not very good, but he was our country's greatest ex-president. And I was talking here a minute ago. The more we understand what he did as president, the more substantial it becomes. He did a lot of very important stuff as president, energy and treaties and on and on and on. But obviously, one of the great men of the age, he and Rosalind both, as former president and first lady. In the course of all of this, I had taken a job in D.C. I was heading a group called Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And I was glad it was a fun thing to do. I went out to lunch one day and came back, and the secretary said, "You had a phone call?" And I said, "Okay." And she said, "He said he was Jimmy Carter." And I said, "Well, I think I will return that phone call." And sure enough, it was Carter. And he was putting together his first group to go and do Habitat for Humanity. And he said, "Help me find some people who would like to do this." And I suggested 3 or 4 people, 2 of whom really became part of his early days with Habitat. Roy and Louise Wood from Arlington, Texas, that we knew, and J.W. and Willeen Wallace. J.W. still is a Baptist preacher, and they went and did several trips with the Carters. I never did go on a build. It never did work out for me to go on what they called a build. Quickly, Linda and I decided that we would always celebrate our time at the White House with the Carters, but we would not live out of that. The quarterback made the winning touchdown, and the rest of his life, that was all he could talk about. Obviously, we were deeply grateful for the chance to be with the Carters at the White House. But we also decided we would keep up with them to the best of our ability. And I don't want to ever suggest that we just dropped by the house in Plains for coffee. We didn't do that. we had a cordial friendship with them. I preached in Plains a lot. We went to Oslo when he got the Peace Prize. We were at the opening of the Carter Center in Atlanta. Knew the family, a lot of the family, in and out. So it was a great moment for us. They're just, they're just a million stories of all of this stuff. Our time is gone. But would thank God for the opportunity to know Jimmy and Rosalind so closely. We have a few minutes for Q&A, or okay?
I know that Jimmy Carter signed a pact with the states during his presidency that created the Friendship Force. The first state was New Mexico, but Georgia had a big part in that.
Okay. That part I don't know. That's good to know. I didn't know that. That's another one of those pieces
Yeah,
that
well,
we need to understand.
it was done
more.
with the guy who was chaplain in Big Canoe. That guy was very politically involved
Yeah.
with the Arab world,
Good,
and
okay.
so. But you don't have any story
Right.
about
I'm
that.
glad to know that. Carter created Department of Education, and I believe even the Department of Energy while he was in the White House. Yeah.
Do you think that the separation of church and state is a dead concept?
Well, I think it's vital. This was one of the hallmarks of the founding of the country. As you know, all of the European powers had a church state, a state church. And so Jefferson and others in Madison worked out that we would have this institutional, organizational separation. We would not have a state church, nor would be a church state, so that separation. And for the first many years, there was no conflict with that. But as the country changed, the issues began to arise. Exactly what does that mean? It comes in for a lot of trashing today. That idea of separation never did say that you had to leave your faith at the door when you walked into a political office. But it does say that as much as we possibly can, we maintain that separation so that government does not run the church and the church does not run the government. So it's a very, very vital issue under constant attack these days for political reasons and for the lack of understanding about it. The big issue became joined a long time ago when the Supreme Court ruled that you could not have state-enforced prayer in public schools. The court never did say that you couldn't pray in school. The joke was, as long as you had a math test, you were going to have prayers in school, You were going to have that. But the state could not mandate a prayer, and that was the issue. But it got translated, purposefully or unpurposefully, that you couldn't pray in school, and that was never the issue there. So yeah, it's a vital issue, and the country is better and religion is better because of that separation there.
More questions?
Okay, we have one here.
Okay.
Vicki and I were living in Atlanta when they dedicated the Carter Center.
What now? Say it again, please.
So, my wife and I were living in Atlanta when they dedicated the Carter Center. And so we decided we would go
Yeah.
to it. And Ronald Reagan came from Washington and made the speech that dedicated the center.
Right.
And he and Jimmy became real good friends after he lost the election.
Right, yeah.
And Reagan made the most beautiful speech you could imagine. It was eloquent. He never looked at a note, and it was just amazing. And after he finished, Jimmy got up and he said, "Now you know why I lost the election."
Yeah. I never did like Ronald Reagan because he beat Jimmy Carter. That was just the fact of the matter. But he was a class act. Reagan was a class act. A lot of the stuff that he talked about doing made me uncomfortable. But he and Carter became cordial friends. Carter particularly became a great friend with Gerald Ford. And he and Gerald Ford had a deal. Whoever died first, the other would do the eulogy. Of course, Gerald died first, and Carter went to Grand Rapids and did the eulogy. And then at the Carter funeral, when Carter died these few months ago, Gerald Ford's son read the eulogy that President Ford had written for Jimmy Carter. So that they kind of closed that loop there. So they became, and the only time I ever really saw in the flesh Gerald Ford was at the Carter Center. He was there for some kind of event, and we went. Quickly, one more quick story. Along the way, the Department of Agriculture, under Democrat, restored Carter's boyhood home. Carter was actually raised in a little bitty, hardly a village called Ranger, and they lived in a Sears Roebuck house. The train brought the building and the house in, and Mr. Carter built the house. Didn't have a bathroom or anything like that. So we went for that, for the opening of the Carter boyhood home, and then later we would when we could we went. There was the big annual event at the Carter Center that Lynn and I went often to. You spent 2 days at the Carter Center, and then you spent another day in Plains. We would go down to Plains and all. And we'd been to the boyhood. Lynn and I had been to the boyhood home a couple of times. So we were wandering through some part of the town there, and Linda turned to me and said, "I don't think I want to do the boyhood home again. We've done that." We didn't know that Carter was standing behind her, and he said, "Well, whatever." So we went to the boyhood home again. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
This was
you.
delightful.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you for your time.
We all wrote a book. This is my
Yes.
preacher at the White House. So it was great fun, opportunity of a lifetime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for bringing this.
Tell us about Luke in Ukraine.
Luke, my grandson, is in Ukraine, doing quite well. He has developed his own system. What it seems like that World Food Organization send in foodstuffs on these big pallets, big loads. And then Luke has created an organization, a volunteer bunch of Ukrainian people, and they then go and break down those pallets into family sizes. So people come to him, and then along the way, with his inventiveness, he managed to get buy a little van of some kind. So he goes up in country and takes that. And they do the same thing, particularly in the winter, with clothing. People send in clothing, and they do that. So he's well situated. We hope he can come home for either Thanksgiving or Christmas. He hadn't been home in a year. He's afraid if he comes home, he can't go back. You know, the immigration is all mixed up these days. So anyway, but he's loved it, and it's changed his life entirely.